Hello and welcome back to Podfinder. This is day 10 of the 12 Days of Sinmas. And if you don't know what that means, pause this video and check out the playlist I've linked in the description. The Prelude video explains everything. Today, I'm entering the home stretch for this series, taking a look at the Sin of Envy, the nation of Edasseril, and the Runelords of Abjuration. I'm in the back half of my examination of the sins of Thassilon now, and I can see the light at the end of this tunnel. If you thought I covered a lot of Runelords in quick succession yesterday with the Lords of Sloth, you ain't seen nothing yet. If the Runelords of Envy were good at anything, it was killing each other and taking power for themselves. Before that, though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. And, before I forget, check out the timeline I put together of Thassilon's history. If you're a visual person, it will really help you get a hold of the history of Xin and the Runelords who would take over his empire. Link in the description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's dig in. The Sin of Envy was a corruption of the virtue of charity, and was associated with the School of Abjuration. Rune mages of charity and envy would experience a heightened awareness of their own weaknesses when they first cast an abjuration spell, and this awareness provided them with the necessary information to shore up those weaknesses. Virtuous charitable casters would accept this knowledge of weakness and channel it into a recognition that weakness was present in all people, then would use their resources to help those whose vulnerabilities were the most significant. Those indulging in the sin of envy, however, felt this awareness fuel a deep sense of jealousy of their peers. The knowledge of their own weakness only made them fixate upon the strengths others possessed, and then desire those strengths for themselves. The School of Abjuration. The School of Abjuration is defined as much by what it undoes as by what it does. Abjuration is the art of countering magic from an external source, either by blocking it, matching it with equal and opposite power, or unraveling its fundamental building blocks until it simply ceases to be. It is far and away the most defensive of the 8 schools defined by rune magic, and its depth is defined not by the effects it can create, but by the effects it can counter. By definition, most spells of the Abjuration school are reactive in nature. They require another spell to counter in order to be effective. Abjurers can, and often do, take proactive measures, such as the precasting of wards and shields before a fight, but even these spells only ever take effect when confronted by hostile magic. Many abjurers consequently take the stance that the best offense is a good defense. In combat, they often allow foes to expend their most powerful spells quickly, leading them to burn out before moving in for the kill. Alternatively, they might allow foes to simply produce the circumstances of their own doom, hanging them with a rope of their own making, so to speak. This might take the form of a precisely timed casting of Dispel magic, preventing a foe from teleporting out of a dangerous situation, removing the wards or other effects keeping them alive in a hostile environment, or even dispelling the compulsions or illusions keeping their soldiers loyal. Unlike some of the other schools discussed, Abjuration doesn't traditionally have subschools for its spells, at least not since 1E. Instead, most abjurers consider themselves specialized generalists, experts in countering each of the other schools of magic. They tend to immerse themselves in the teachings of the other schools, with the specific goal of understanding the mechanics of each so they can best learn how to counter it. As such, abjurers tend to be well-rounded and well-read, at least compared to students of the other schools, though they also have a tendency to think categorically and methodically. The necessity to understand such a broad swath of magical theory often forces abjurers to think in correspondingly broad strokes, meaning they often fall into generalizations. They put topics into neat little boxes in their minds, allowing them to grasp concepts quickly, but often missing nuance or detail as a result. Within the confines of rune magic, abjurers were precluded from casting spells of the evocation and necromancy schools. Limited access to spells which dealt direct damage forced many abjurers to rely even more heavily on their reactive spells, putting them in a defensive mindset even outside of direct combat. Similarly, their limited access to healing magic reinforced their need to harden their defenses and to prevent themselves or their allies from ever being harmed in the first place. These two factors created a feedback loop of forcing abjurers under rune magic to focus on and strengthen their defenses, specializing further and further as their careers and the study of the field more broadly progressed. The Rune of Envy was sometimes seen as a crown, indicating the imperious haughtiness with which the practitioners of envy sometimes carried themselves. Some practitioners of charity have instead displayed the rune in a sideways orientation, giving it the appearance of a magical barrier or shield. Or, if you're my wife, you might interpret the Rune of Abjuration as the letter E for envy, which simply fell over. Love you, honey. Never change. The Runelords of Envy. The first Runelord of Envy was Naaft, a woman who earned her position by distinguishing herself among Xin's apprentices as the most talented and powerful abjurer of her generation. Relatively little is known about Naaft, for reasons which will become clear in a minute, but she was likely of a noble Aslanti background like her fellow Runelords. That being said, I do think it would be appropriate if Naaft had been the one Runelord to have come from a non-noble background. That would certainly explain her descent into jealousy and her incessant need to prove herself superior to her peers. Again, though, this is speculation and fan theorizing on my part. We really have no idea exactly where Naaft came from. As the first Runelord of Charity, Naaft was the recipient of the Alarakin of Charity, the Abjurant Halberd. In creating this weapon, Xin sought to create a check on the weapons and powers of all the other Runelords. As such, the weapon was imbued with a consciousness which desired to counteract, balance, and control the magic wielded by spellcasters in its vicinity. Unfortunately, as Naaft herself fell into a life of sin and envious power-mongering, those personality traits within the weapon drove it to hate its master and its own existence. Eventually dubbed the Invidious Halberd, the weapon is now known for its intense self-loathing, and the disdain with which it treated its wielders. While it always served the ruling Runelord of Envy unfailingly, the weapon made known its love of killing arcane spellcasters, and it inspired more than a little fear within its masters that one day it might turn on them with glee. It also made a habit of insulting the Runelords of Envy, downplaying their achievements and stoking jealousy and feelings of inadequacy in their hearts. Mechanically, the Invidious Halberd is a +2 Dispelling Burst Keen spell-storing mithril halberd. That's a mouthful. When it hits an opponent, the weapon can attempt to absorb one of that opponent's spells of 3rd rank or lower, though the target can attempt a will save to negate this effect. On a critical hit, the weapon can afflict the target with a Feeble Mind spell, though this too can be negated by a will save. This is one of the middling weapons of rule by my assessment. Stronger than the Burning Glaive or the Dragon-Tooth Spear, but decidedly weaker than the weapons of Sorshan, Alasnist, or Xandergul. Upon her appointment to the position of Runelord in -4480 AR, Naaft took up the management of the realm of Edasseril, the westernmost of the member kingdoms of Thassilon. Edasseril was the domain of striving ambition, and existed on what is nowadays called the Ironbound Archipelago, between Varissia and the lands of the Lenorm kings. At the time of Thassilon, however, this land was actually a peninsula, as the sea levels were a bit lower relative to the mountains. Edasseril was a materially rich nation, with rich veins of ore and gemstones hidden beneath the earth, and forests full of timber and wild game ripe for harvesting. The mountainous terrain was also less openly hostile than that of Bakrakhan to the south, leading to a flourishing local ecosystem for mountain-dwelling herd animals, like horses, sheep, and aurochs. Despite these material resources, however, all was not well in Edasseril. Ettercaps, now called web lurkers, were a constant threat in the kingdom, and brought with them the dangers of the 8-legged arachnids which they controlled. Ettins were also native to the region, and made a nuisance of themselves with regularity. There were several other giants native to Edasseril as well, most notably forest giants. On top of that, Edasseril as a nation became infected with the very sin which corrupted Naaft herself, envy. Naaft fostered a culture of jealousy, backstabbing, and one-upsmanship among her apprentices and nobles, and this culture eventually disseminated into the general populace. Edasseril played host to dozens of assassin and poisoners guilds, all of which found clients and targets aplenty among the nation's elite. Tireless plotting was the norm within the halls of power in Edasseril, and murder was commonplace. Speaking of the halls of power, Naaft selected as her capital a marshland in south-central Edasseril. This location left her extremely protected from her fellow runelords, as only an approach by sea would be viable as a means of attack, and none of the nations of Thassilon were known to field powerful navies. Unfortunately, this location also left Naaft isolated from her fellows, meaning that she and her successors would always be kept at arm's length in their dealings with their 6 archwizard peers. On top of that, the location for the capital city, which would eventually be called Xin-Edasseril, was a downright mess. The whole city was built on top of a bog, leading to poor drainage and a high rate of infectious disease. Multiple plagues struck Xin-Edasseril throughout its history, and this poor location was the primary cause. Despite this, Xin-Edasseril was universally regarded, at least from extant reports, to be a grand city and a marvel of architecture and wealth. Little is known about the city's layout, but it was generally regarded as in line with its fellow Thassilonian capitals, at least in terms of grandeur and excess. Now, before I move on, I do need to make an addendum to everything I've said so far. Edasseril was not always the name of the Realm of Envy. The nation once had another name, one which has been completely lost to time, and one which I can find no record of in any Paizo publication. Naaft changed the nation's name to Edasseril in -6475 AR, 5 years into her rule. This name change was due to jealousy, and is, in my humble opinion, the ultimate representation of Naaft's fall to the sin of envy. But to explain this assessment, I need to backtrack ever so slightly. During the initial days of the Thassilonian Empire, before the Runelords were appointed, Xin and his armies were forced to conquer huge swaths of territory to establish their new kingdom. While many of the giants and humans in the region eventually fell before Thassilon's rising tide, the elves of the Miarani forest resisted. These elves survived the onslaught of Xin's armies, and remained an independent nation all the way until the Earthfall calamity in -5293. The elves of Miarani were known among the Thassilonians for their grace and beauty, and they ruled their nation from their glorious capital of Selwynvian, resisting all attempts at encroachment on the part of their aggressive neighbors. Though the Miarani elves were generally isolationists, they were known to engage in various border skirmishes and secret raids from time to time, and their boundless ability to resist Thassilonian incursion and strike successfully and repeatedly well into Thassilonian territory made them a thorn in the sides of the Runelords, and none more so than Naaft. In a petty act of jealousy, Naaft stole the name of the fairest princess of Selwynvian, an elf woman named Edasseril. The Runelord of Envy renamed her nation Edasseril in a mocking attempt to usurp and surpass some of the elves' beauty and grace. Her hope was that Edasseril the nation might outlive the elves for which it was named, and thus surpass them in glory and recognition. For this reason, I love that the writers at Paizo managed to shove this back in Naaft's face. The ruling queen of Kyonin, in the Age of Lost Omens, is a scion of that same noble elven house. Her name is Queen Talandia Edasseril of Kyonin. Meanwhile, the nation of Edasseril has long since vanished from the face of Golarion, at least in its original incarnation. Naaft died in -6442 AR, after just 38 years on the throne. Only Caladerne, the first Runelord of Greed, ruled for less, and neither of these two lived to see the death of Xin. She was succeeded by Runelord Tannaris, who oversaw his nation's involvement in both the creation of the Rune Giants and the assassination of Xin, both of which I've discussed in detail. Tannaris' greatest accomplishment, however, or at least the accomplishment for which he is the most well known, is the creation of his Alara High, the Sword of Envy. The exact date of the forging of Tannaris, the Sword of Envy, is unknown, though it is known to have been created prior to -6360 AR. And yes, the Runelord and the Sword do share a name. We'll get to that. Interestingly, this is the first of the Swords of Sin to be created, and actually predates the founding of the Runeforge, meaning this is quite possibly the only one of the 7 swords to have been forged on the material plane, and within the territory of its respective Runelord. Anyway, as the Runelord of Envy, Tannaris was an extremely jealous man. He sought to make himself master of all skills, and despised those who exceeded him in expertise. Tannaris had a son, whom he, of course, named Tannaris. Junior was brought up by the weapon masters of Edasseril, and was raised from birth to be his father's champion and greatest warrior. Tannaris Sr. even had plans to use his own son's body as a vessel for his own consciousness, should his body ever fail, though these plans would never come to fruition. Eventually, Junior was presented with the Sword of Envy, a magic-dispelling blade of incredible power. He took up the sword and became his father's most loyal bodyguard. But of course, the envy which consumed Runelord Tannaris knew no limits, and he soon grew jealous of his own son's skills. In -6360 AR, Runelord Tannaris attacked his son, intending to strike him down and name a less powerful champion. Junior, however, had no delusions about his father's true nature, and was thus prepared. The father and son fought a fierce contest, which eventually resulted in both of their deaths. Only the sword itself survived the fight, though it had become infused with a new consciousness. From that day forward, the sword identified itself as Tannaris, though whether the mind of the father or the son had been bound to the blade remains unknown to this day. Mechanically, Tannaris is a +5 defending bastard sword, with the unique ability to maintain its enhancements to attack and damage, while also augmenting the wielder's AC. Additionally, on a successful hit, the sword could dispel a spell effect affecting its target, provided that target failed a will save. On a critical hit, this effect dispelled all the spells affecting the chosen target, though again, a will save could negate the effect. And now, I would like to welcome you back to the rapid-fire portion of the program. Like I mentioned earlier, if there was one area where all the Runelords of Envy excelled, it was in the killing and replacing of their superiors. Runelord Naaft cultivated a culture of jealous backstabbing, and her nation was never able to shake that culture off. As such, the Runelords of Envy were constantly fending off assaults from their apprentices, and Edasseril saw the highest rate of turnover among its leaders of all the 7 kingdoms of Thassilon. Unfortunately, very few of these Runelords present much in terms of distinctive identity, rulership style, or personality. That said, any one of them might make for an excellent blank slate for GMs to use in their homebrew campaigns set in and around Varisia and the Ironbound Isles. Ivamura succeeded Tannaris in -6360 AR, and she ruled as the 3rd Runelord of Envy for 59 years, before her death in -6301. Notably, Ivamura is the only Runelord I could identify who died at the hands of an external, meaning non-Thassilonian, force. She was killed by the Aslanti invaders during the Thassilon-Aslant War of -6301. Like I mentioned before, her capital city was poorly positioned to defend from a naval assault, and the Aslanti had a terribly powerful navy. Ivamura was succeeded by Jura, who ruled as the 4th Runelord of Envy for 151 years. He was eventually killed by none other than Xandergul, the first and only Runelord of Pride. Xandergul killed both Jura and Afarend of Gluttony in a successful attempt to stave off an all-out civil war among the Runelords of Thassilon. What Jura did to draw Xandergul's attention and ire is unclear. Chalsardra took up the position of Runelord in minus 6150, and ruled as the 5th Runelord of Envy for an impressive 184 years. Relatively little occurred during her rule, at least in terms of world events. Chalsardra was succeeded in minus 5966 by Ezedrea, who took up the position of 6th Runelord of Envy and ruled for another 170 years. Her rule, too, was relatively uneventful until her eventual ousting from power. Zarv took over in minus 5796, though his rule was limited to a single century. During his reign, he witnessed the rise of both Karzug and Alasnist, as well as the start of their notorious 400-year conflict. Desamelia then ascended to power in minus 5696 AR. She would go on to become the most successful Runelord of Envy, at least in terms of length of rulership. She ruled for 207 years, and in her time on the throne, she witnessed the rise of both Kroon and Zutha. Despite her apparent power and guile, she was eventually overthrown by Firandi, the penultimate Runelord of Envy. Firandi rose to power as the 9th Runelord of Envy in minus 5489, and he would go on to rule for 87 years. Firandi was a severe-looking man, with a hawkish face and a stern demeanor. Unfortunately, little is known about Firandi himself, as much of his story is wrapped up in the story of Belimarius, his eventual successor. So, without further ado, it's time to discuss the Rise of Belimarius. Belimarius was born during the reign of Firandi, about 20 or so years into his rule. Her family was one of means, though they lacked any noble titles to speak of, and thus lacked any form of credibility or recognition among their peers. Belimarius's family life was therefore one of bitter wanting, as her relatives yearned in vain for the stations and honors which they felt they were owed. This instilled in Belimarius a deep-seated sense of entitlement and a jealous need to prove herself. Belimarius appears to have been born with a natural talent for magic, though she also seems to have been equally hard-working in her youth. In a bid to finally achieve the acclaim she felt she deserved, she applied as a teenager to the Arcanium Abjurant, the most elite magical academy in Edasseril. Despite her qualifications, her bid was rejected, a setback which Belimarius herself attributed to her family's low standing, rather than any failing on her part. With her plans for her future dashed, she secured a thankless and demanding job as a tax collector in the employ of Runelord Firandi's treasury. Though the job was menial, Belimarius threw herself into her work and excelled. Her cleverness, eye for detail, and natural talent for organization served her well, and she quickly began to climb the ranks of the Edasserilian bureaucracy. Many of her promotions were suspiciously well-timed, as she would master the tasks of one job just before the death or retirement of her immediate superior, leaving her as the natural choice for the newly opened position. Still, no evidence of Belimarius's ill intent or guilt was ever found, and her skill in finance was undeniable. Of course, Belimarius's rapid ascension through the ranks was no accident. The young woman's heart burned with envy and outrage, and this inner fire drove her to continue her magical education in private. In just a few short years, Belimarius had become a self-taught wizard of impressive skill, and she put her considerable magical talents to use in engineering the deaths of her superiors, ensuring a path forward for herself. While she wasn't above murder, by any means, she also mastered the more subtle arts of blackmail, slander, and theft to ensure her own advancement. The whole time, she considered a life in finance beneath her, and she privately fumed at those above her. She resented them for the years they forced her to toil in obscurity, and sought a method of escape from the mundane life to which they had sentenced her. In a matter of a few short years, Belimarius had worked her way to the top of Edasseril's financial apparatus. At the mere age of 20, she had become one of the most important and powerful financiers in the nation, but still her jealousy knew no bounds. This situation finally came to a head when Belimarius learned of the admission of a girl named Vexnil to the halls of the Arcanium Abjurant. Vexnil was the daughter of Firandi's head treasurer, who was himself Belimarius's boss. Belimarius became incensed at the idea that this girl, who, by her assessment at least, showed no substantial magical aptitude, would be admitted to the school, based solely on the strength of her family name. Irate, and finally unable to control her outrage any longer, Belimarius took action. She used her magic to arrange the death of Vexnil, and this time she took none of the precautions which she had previously used to hide her identity. She hoped that the mistresses of the Arcanium might take notice of her crime, then track her down and be impressed enough with her skill to allow her to take Vexnil's vacated position at the school. The attention she drew with this stunt, however, was far greater than she could have hoped for. Runelord Firandi himself took note of Vexnil's murder, and tracked the crime back to Belimarius with ease. He found himself impressed by the young woman's accomplishments, and even more so when he discovered that she lacked a formal magical education. Firandi praised Belimarius's accomplishments, as well as her obvious talent, then offered her the recognition she had always sought, a position as his personal apprentice. Belimarius accepted on the spot. Belimarius spent the next 40 years at Firandi's side. She studied under his tutelage as his apprentice, and even worked her way up to becoming his personal advisor. Her natural talents with finance were even more useful to the Runelord than her arcane abilities, but he kept up his end of the bargain. Firandi mentored her in all the finer points of abjuration magic, taking Belimarius's talent and channeling it into a rigorous and comprehensive curriculum of formal study and hands-on training. Eventually, though, even this was not enough to stave off Belimarius's insecurities. She soon began to wonder if Firandi was holding her back, taking advantage of her powers to further his own goals. Once she had come to this conclusion, it took the young wizard little time to form and execute a plan. She poisoned or killed Firandi's various other apprentices, then captured the Runelord himself in an eternal coffin made of pure force. Firandi was left to starve in that coffin, though he would live long enough to see Belimarius claim his throne and instill herself as the 10th and final Runelord of Envy. The Rule of Belimarius. Belimarius took power in -5402 AR, making her the last Runelord to be crowned during the Thassilonian period. No other Runelords would rise prior to the coming of the Earthfall calamity. Belimarius was a haughty, obstinate woman, whose face was generally twisted into a dismissive sneer. Having not risen to power until well into her 60s, and having made no deals with eldritch beings or alchemical experiments to preserve her youth, Belimarius was the oldest in appearance of the final Runelords of Thassilon. She appeared as a heavy-set matronly woman who carried herself with an air of stern superiority. She dressed in regal clothing, and had no problem decorating herself in all the fineries her station had to offer. In an interview, James Jacobs, the creative director at Paizo, once mentioned that all the Runelords had a deal, which represented the core of their visual design, and Belimarius's deal was Evil Grandma. In addition to her weapon of rule, the invidious halberd, which I discussed earlier, Belimarius was known to carry a few other powerful artifacts on her person. The first of these was a Rod of Cancellation of her own design, a device capable of nullifying even the most powerful spells thrown her way. The second artifact appears to have been one half of an artifact called Vanity's Eye, which Belimarius herself developed. This mirror allowed her to drain the natural charisma of another, pouring that force of personality into her own body, and enhancing her confidence, sense of self, and personal magnetism. She also wore the robes of Xin-Edasseril, the magical defensive robes which all the Runelords of Envy wore, in addition to numerous other magical items to ensure her own safety. Belimarius made for an exceptionally effective ruler, at least when judging her as a head of state. The economy of Edasseril flourished under her rule, and trade expanded significantly. The standard of living in Edasseril, at least among the nobility, increased significantly. As international trade picked up, harvests became more bountiful, and magical study grew steadily in her 109 years on the throne. Much of this academic prosperity took the form of research programs sponsored directly by Belimarius. The heads of these programs were granted free rein to study their topics of interest, so long as those interests could be used to advance Belimarius's own knowledge and goals. One such program was run by the scholar Thieltamar, who promised Belimarius numerous breakthroughs in the realm of sky metal research. Thieltamar, a devout follower of Tsar Azmak, the late demon lord of Rust, held a genuine interest in the study of metal, but also spent his time studying a method of resurrecting his dead god. Thieltamar established a series of towers on the southern coast of Edasseril, which he dubbed the Valoric Spires. This was only one of several research facilities which sprang up across the nation under Belimarius's rule. Of course, all this success did little to engender love on the part of Edasseril's citizenry for their reigning runelord. Belimarius was as feared as any runelord before her, and her fierce competence only served to increase that fear. She was generally seen as cruel, short-tempered, and vicious, and rightly so by my assessment. She spent much of her time on the throne rooting out disloyalty, perceived and real, and resorted to poison, assassination, and other vile tools of control to ensure that her rule was never threatened. As a reminder to her subjects about just who was in charge, Belimarius displayed the coffin of force which had ensnared Firandi in her throne room. The old runelord's corpse remained trapped within, rotting and decaying over the decades, always ensuring that any who thought of disobeying Belimarius were well aware of the fate which awaited them. While not well liked by her citizenry, Belimarius commanded the loyalty of her city watch, the Emerald Guard. Well, as much as loyalty could be commanded in the realm of envy. While little has been detailed about the structure of the Order of Warriors, what is known is that the soldiers were exceptionally well trained, especially those stationed in and around the palace. The members of the Emerald Guard, for whom I have found stat blocks, were all level 14 fighters, making them among the most powerful run-of-the-mill soldiers I've ever seen in a Pathfinder adventure path. Near the end of Belimarius's rule, the Emerald Guard was commanded by Xochitl, Belimarius's chosen champion, and the last bearer of Tannaris, the Sword of Envy. Xochitl is notable for having been a half-elf, much to his shame. Hatred of Miarani still ran deep in Edasserilian culture, even late into the Thassilonian period, and Xochitl's elven heritage was a source of much self-loathing. Xochitl had distinguished himself with his impressive skill and work ethic. After being appointed to the position of Belimarius's champion, Xochitl struck a bargain with his mistress. He would serve with absolute loyalty if she would use her most powerful magic to transform him into that which he desperately yearned to be, a pure-blooded Aslanti human. Belimarius took the deal, though she failed to hold up her end of the bargain before the Earthfall calamity. Among her fellow runelords, Belimarius was often dismissed as fairly weak and a newcomer on the international stage. She often engaged in various plots against the other runelords of Thassilon, but these rarely drew a direct response from their targets. The reason for this is unclear, though it seems likely that Xandergul and Sorshan simply didn't view her as a threat, while Alasnist and Karzug were far too preoccupied with one another to make time for her. While this likely irritated Belimarius and contributed to her perpetual sense of feeling undervalued, she certainly had enough domestic challenges to keep her attention. Speaking of domestic policy, Belimarius made her most impactful decision as a leader very early on in her reign. While the capital of Xin-Edasseril remained a grand city, its location brought with it myriad problems. As mentioned earlier, the entire city was built on a swamp, leading to constant outbreaks of disease. The capital was also isolated from the rest of Thassilon, which provided a substantial defense, but also left the city in a difficult position regarding trade. On top of all of this, the entrenched bureaucracy and cutthroat culture of Edasseril was tied deeply into the city's geography, with numerous poisoner and assassination guilds deeply rooted within the city. With all these headwinds inhibiting her own success, Belimarius made a dramatic decision. She chose to relocate her capital city. Belimarius moved her seat of power from old Xin-Edasseril to her hometown, a backwater trading port on the far eastern edge of Edasseril. This placed new Xin-Edasseril in close proximity to Cyrusian, the realm of pride, exposing the new capital to the dangers of invasion, but also tying the nation into the broader economic systems of Thassilon as a whole. While this move brought with it a whole host of logistical challenges, Belimarius proved more than capable of handling them. The economic prosperity I described earlier all took place despite, and in part because of, this move. The relocation of the capital also allowed Belimarius to take greater direct control of her nation, as the various guilds which had entrenched themselves into the inner workings of old Xin-Edasseril would have been thrown off by this sudden change in the nation's economic and government function. This likely placed these guilds on the back foot, and allowed Belimarius to assert her authority without having to deal with these power brokers at their full strength. Thankfully, Paizo has given us a decent look at Belimarius's capital of New Xin-Edasseril, so I'm going to take a brief minute here to describe it in more detail. New Xin-Edasseril. In establishing her new capital city, Runelord Belimarius first needed to construct her own seat of power, a fortress from which she could rule, which projected the might and majesty of her kingdom, and the wisdom with which she ruled it. The Palace Miasmoria was her chosen solution. While not especially large, the Palace Miasmoria was a grand building, decorated with a degree of opulence worthy of a runelord. Marble floors with emerald inlay were the norm throughout the building, and gold-plated reliefs adorned the walls. Gilded statues of Belimarius graced the entrance, though these were, in fact, gold golems, intended to ensure the building's security. Even more impressive than the palace's decorations were its defenses. The entire palace was blanketed in a mage's private sanctum effect, as well as a dimensional lock spell. The doors within the palace were also shielded, outfitted with powerful arcane locks and magical alarms which notified Belimarius personally of any intrusion. Just east of the Palace Miasmoria was the covetous Chorus, a neighborhood occupied by Belimarius's most loyal bureaucrats. This neighborhood was separated from much of the rest of the city by a series of walls, and was the closest neighborhood to Belimarius's palace. The majority of Belimarius's palace staff lived here. This neighborhood also housed the Ministry of Tithes, the branch of the treasury which had once employed a young Belimarius herself. On both the extreme east and extreme west ends of the city, densely packed neighborhoods of haphazard design played host to the majority of the citizens of New Xin-Edasseril. These were Envy Row East and Envy Row West. Even in constructing a brand new city as her capital, Belimarius had been unable to avoid the construction of such overcrowded and compact neighborhoods as these. Then again, she might have simply not cared about those citizens too poor to afford better housing. On the northeastern side of town, the Bazaar of Rivals was the heart of trade within the city. Under Belimarius's highly competent rule, trade within the nation of Edasseril flourished, and nowhere was this better expressed than in the Bazaar of Rivals. Shopkeepers here were able to provide all manner of magic items, and even spellcasting services all the way up to 9th rank. In the center of the city was the finest neighborhood of all, the Emerald Enlightenment, the center of magical learning in all of Edasseril. The neighborhood played host to the Arcanium Abjurant, the rebuilt incarnation of the magical academy which had once rejected the application of Belimarius. The campus of the Mages' College was sprawling, though Belimarius ensured that her mark was left on the institution. A massive sculpture of the Runelord stood within the marble facility's courtyard, acting as a constant reminder of the school's biggest mistake in refusing her admission. One more structure stood out in Xin-Edasseril, both for its architectural majesty as well as for the defiance it represented. The Temple of Desna's First Dream was the grandest of the many Desnan temples scattered throughout Thassilon. Constructed entirely from diamonds, gemstones, glass, and raw magical force, the temple was as majestic a sight as could be beheld throughout the empire. The faith of Desna was an oddity in ancient Thassilon. In an empire ruled by Sin, whose leaders owed allegiance to all manner of demons, devils, and eldritch abominations, the idea of a faith as benevolent as Desna's being tolerated might seem absurd. And yet, despite these extreme circumstances, or perhaps even because of them, the faith of Desna flourished among the lower classes of Thassilon, and especially among the Varisians and Shoan-Ti. The Wandering Star's teachings, with their emphasis on freedom, self-expression, luck, and travel, took root among the oppressed peoples of the Empire, and proved nearly impossible to weed out. While many rulers, like Alasnist, seemed content to simply ignore Desna's faith, at least the rulers of Edasseril and Cyrusian sought to incorporate it into their power structures. In the case of Belimarius, she formalized her relationship with the faith by funding the construction of the Temple of Desna's First Dream, ensuring that its permanent location and grand facade was as much a dedication to her own glory as it was to Desna's. Rumors also swirled in the capital that Belimarius even used the temple as a secret vault for an enormous treasure hoard. For their part, the priests of Desna who staffed the temple had little interest in maintaining this diplomatic tie, and I know of at least one attempt made by the priests to extricate themselves and their church from Belimarius's grasp. The Other Works of Belimarius. Despite her relatively short time on the throne, Belimarius is credited with the creation, refinement, and employment of many spells, magic items, and even several artifacts. One of the best examples I can think of when considering Belimarius's envious attitude and her approach to magic is the Covetous Aura spell. This effect draped the caster in an abjurant aura, which could siphon off magic cast within it and redirect those energies to the caster. This allowed the caster to benefit from buff spells cast within the aura, even if the caster wasn't the intended target, though they were limited to benefiting from only one of these spells at a time. Belimarius also developed a simple but especially devastating effect simply dubbed the Curse of Belimarius. This curse placed a magical ward upon the target, cloaking them in a field of magical resistance. This resistance, however, only applied against harmless spells, meaning buffs and healing spells. The caster of these beneficial spells, including the target of the curse themselves, needed to overcome this magical resistance in order to get their spells to stick on the target. This effect was so powerful that only 7th rank spells or higher, like the 1E Limited Wish, could remove it. While this curse effect has, so far, only been implemented in 1E, I think it could very easily be converted to 2E. In addition to the many powerful spells to which they had access, Belimarius and her servants also made use of many powerful magic items. Belimarius herself had access to her robes of Xin-Edasseril and her Sihedron tome, but also made use of numerous magical and anti-magical rods and staves. The Rod of Cancellation was one such device, which Belimarius heavily favored. But the Staff of Edasseril's Scorn and Staff of Edasseril's Denial were other such devices. These magical staves made use of the Covetous Aura, Spell Crash, and Stunning Barrier spells, granting the staff's wielder access to some impressive abjuration effects, both to protect themselves and tear down the defenses of their opponents. The Dust of Envy was a less powerful item, consisting of a jar of abjuration-infused powder. It was typically worn around the bearer's neck in a small vial, which could be quickly removed and thrown. The powder, when released, enacted a dispel magic effect, though this could only target magic tied to either evocation or necromancy, the opposition schools of abjuration. Where the Dust of Envy was more general purpose and had a myriad of uses, the rune-warded gauntlets were far more specific. These armored gloves allowed the wearer to carry sentient magic items while remaining protected from the influence of the item's consciousness. Within the context of ancient Thassilon, this effect had one particular use case: the handling of an opposing nation's Alara Keen and Alara High. The weapons of rule and the swords of sin of each of the 7 Thassilonian member states were among the most powerful artifacts to which the runelords of each nation had access. The weapons could actively resist use by anyone other than their runelord, or their designated champion, and so were very difficult to steal, hide, or even examine. Belimarius developed the rune-warded gauntlets to bypass these innate defenses, allowing her or her followers to take up the weapons of the other rune lords without suffering the negative consequences of trying to wield them against their nature. To my knowledge, these gauntlets were never put to this purpose, at least prior to Earthfall. The final Relic of Envy, which I will discuss here, is a powerful and dangerous artifact created by Belimarius herself. The final Runelord of Envy was exceptionally talented at the creation of wards and other defensive barriers, and as her life went on, she developed a habit of placing protective effects on even the most mundane of her possessions. This obsessively protective behavior eventually extended to the people in her life whom she deemed useful or valuable, or whom she thought might be taken and targeted for use against her. To address this danger, Belimarius created a set of small amulets, each set with a large diamond, which history has dubbed the Envidian Eyes. To be clear, the Envidian Eye is the name given to the only remaining instance of such an artifact in the Age of Lost Omens, and I honestly have no idea what these were called during Belimarius's reign. The Envidian Eye was imbued with incredibly powerful protective magic, and was intended to be worn by a specific target. The amulet could detect incoming hostile spells targeting the wearer, and was designed to respond to these spells by casting abjurant magic to counter the effects. The artifact could cast the following spells in response to various external magical stimuli: Freedom of Movement, now called Unfettered Movement, Greater Dispel Magic, Remove Curse, and Protection from Chaos. Each of these spells could be cast 3 times per day, but they would be cast automatically, with no method of control on the part of the wearer. Runelord Belimarius also implemented an effect to guarantee her continued influence over the wearer. The bearer of the Envidian Eye always failed any saving throw attempted against a scrying effect, ensuring that the Runelord of Envy would always be able to observe her charges. Despite the power of the Envidian Eye, however, Belimarius recognized a problem with its design. If it were simply removed or stolen, then its protective magics would cease to function. To counteract this danger, she imbued the amulets with a degree of sentience, so they might be able to detect when they had transferred ownership. If they were held by someone other than their original intended bearer, they would induce in the bearer dark and self-destructive thoughts. These encouraged the bearer to pursue their own demise, but could be resisted with a degree of willfulness. After 1 week of failing to destroy its new owner, however, the amulets were apparently done messing around. At that point, they would cast a miniaturized prismatic sphere effect into the bearer's throat, suffocating them if they were unable to unravel the effect in time. The only known way to set a new owner for the Envidian Eye was to cast a Mage's Disjunction effect, at which point the amulet would simply imprint upon the first person to pick it up, identifying that person as its new owner. Unfortunately, the level of perception which Belimarius granted to her amulets is extremely limited. The Envidian Eye can only identify the ancestry and gender identity of its bearer, and can't differentiate between, for instance, 2 elf women. If someone of the same ancestry and gender as the intended bearer were to pick up the device, it wouldn't register that it had transferred ownership. I'm not entirely certain why the amulets have this odd oversight in their design. This inability to differentiate between individual humanoids certainly limits the usefulness of the artifact. It might speak to some limitation on the part of Belimarius, since the magic needed to imbue the amulets with further perceptive abilities likely would have been a divination spell, a school in which the Runelord was not a master. Alternatively, it might have simply been too expensive to produce the Envidian Eyes at scale if this level of magic were imbued into them. Regardless of the reason why, it certainly adds a degree of intrigue to a powerful and dangerous artifact. Belimarius's plan to survive Earthfall. Belimarius let much of her focus on magical learning slip. Her efforts to establish a new capital, maintain the economic prosperity of her nation, and root out the traitors among her nobility simply occupied all of her time, and left her with little opportunity to advance her own arcane understanding. For this reason, Belimarius was relatively weak at the time of Earthfall's arrival, at least compared to the other Runelords. She was only a level 18 wizard, making her the second weakest of the Runelords, with only Kroon being considered weaker. That said, Belimarius saw little problem with this for much of her rule, as she was confident that, so long as all 7 Runelords never went to war, she would never have to face her peers in open combat. In that regard, she assumed that the greatest threats to her rule were internal, and that by establishing herself as the absolute ruler of a wealthy and prosperous nation, she could secure for herself centuries of uncontested rule, which she could spend furthering her own arcane pursuits and making up for lost time. All these well-laid plans were shattered in an instant, however, when Belimarius learned of the coming of the Earthfall calamity. It isn't exactly clear how Belimarius found out about Earthfall, but multiple Runelords were aware of it at the time, so her extensive spy network likely played a role in the discovery. Like many of her fellows, Belimarius determined that the best method of guaranteeing her survival was to develop her own personal demiplane through the use of a major runewell. Unfortunately, she was about to regret that century she spent ignoring her arcane studies. While the Runelord of Envy had access to the minor runewell of Envy, as proven by the existence of the Envy spawn, she was unable to employ her understanding of the device to devise the method of the creation of the major runewell she needed. In the extremely short time she had left, which is implied to have been a matter of months or maybe even weeks, Belimarius was forced to seek an external source for the knowledge she lacked. Under normal circumstances, she might have resorted to theft, or even assassination, to acquire the information she sought. But in this case, the only people who knew how to create a major runewell were the 4 mightiest Runelords of all time: Xandergul, Sorshin, Alasnist, and Karzug, all of whom were far too powerful to risk angering. Weighing her options carefully, Belimarius swallowed her pride and approached Karzug, the most predictable of her potential targets. She offered him a payment of treasure which all sources agree was nothing short of outrageous, even by the standards of the Runelords, for his help. Karzug, naturally, agreed. The Runelord of Greed provided Belimarius with the knowledge she needed to complete her runewell, after he'd been paid, of course. Belimarius put this knowledge to use immediately, creating her major runewell of Envy and preparing for her journey into her demiplane, the Eye of Jealousy. So rapid was Belimarius's pace that she overlooked the most obvious possibility imaginable, that Karzug had betrayed her. The Runelord of Greed had, of course, laced his information with hidden half-truths and twisted arcane formulae, and Belimarius, in her hastened desperation, was unable to root out these traps. As Earthfall approached, Belimarius triggered her runewell. At first, all seemed well, but as the Eye of Jealousy sprang into existence, everything went haywire. The runewell collapsed in on itself, and the temporal powers intended to shield its contained demiplane erupted outward, blanketing all of Xin-Edasseril into a swirling vortex of time energy. From the outside, Belimarius's grand capital became encased in a strange crystal brimming with magical energy. The crystal appeared to be solid to its core, and was semi-transparent, allowing those who got too close to peer in at the city within. The city appeared frozen in time, as though it were locked in a massive glob of indestructible amber. And thus ended the story of Belimarius. She, along with the entire city she founded, was trapped, apparently forever, outside of time. Their amber fortress would go on to survive Earthfall, and eventually became known as the Crystalline. Of course, even though Belimarius had unintentionally taken herself out of the picture, her influence and lingering machinations remained behind, long after her apparent death. One contingency plan which Belimarius had put into place was a clever trap, which managed to replicate the effects of Xutha's infamous Runeslave Cauldron. This trap was intended to be triggered by giants, and placed the Runeslave template upon the triggering giant. This template brought along with it a compulsion, which forced the newly enslaved giant to set herself to the task of re-establishing Edasseril and restoring Belimarius's empire to its former glory. For players looking to build characters devoted to the sin of envy, the virtue of charity, or the School of Abjuration more broadly, here are some ideas. Common personal edicts among practitioners of envy might include to keep careful watch on your enemies, to undermine the efforts of your rivals, and to use any means necessary to take that which is owed to you. Conversely, common personal edicts among practitioners of charity might include to converse with others to understand their needs and desires, to donate your time and possessions to better the lives of others, or to live a simple life devoid of personal excesses. For those using the alignment rules, charitable characters will tend toward good, while envious characters will tend toward evil. For characters who want to wield weapons in combat, the halberd and the bastard sword have a strong connection to abjuration magic, due to their connections to the Alara Keen and Alara High of Envy. Abjuration's connection to a more defensive fighting style might lead some characters to consider the use of shields in combat, especially those which can be used to defend against magical attacks, like the Broadleaf or Spellguard shields. Weapons with the parry trait might play on this theme as well, to a lesser degree. Property runes which might connect to abjuration include the Bane property, which exploits the weakness of several creatures, the Authorized rune, to prevent a weapon from being wielded by an enemy, or the Anchoring rune, to prevent extra-dimensional escape. Specialists in abjuration magic might favor green clothing, as green was the color of envy in ancient Thassilon. It was commonly accented with white and gold, though Belimarius also commonly incorporated purple into her outfits. Blue has also been seen as having some connection to abjuration, though only outside of Thassilonian culture. From a meta perspective, I suspect green was chosen as the color of abjuration due to the expression green with envy, but I can't prove that. Belimarius and her cohorts were anything but humble in their dress, and envious characters might tend toward gaudy displays of wealth or power to cover for their own insecurities. By contrast, charitable individuals will likely tend toward more utilitarian garb, intended to be less wasteful. In addition to these general trends in fashion, I also want to call out a few specific magic items commonly carried by abjurers, those being the Rods of Cancellation and Negation, and the Rings of Spell Turning and Counterspelling. These are all incredibly powerful tools in the hands of an experienced abjurer. From a religious perspective, abjuration, envy, and charity have several deific figures of note. Deities with the protection domain and who emphasize defense of one's self and one's community might all connect with the idea of abjuration. These might include the Imperial Lord Archeros, as well as most of the Dwarven pantheon. Conversely, the ambition domain might align very nicely with the teachings of envy, and is commonly held by wicked deities like Droskar, Izeth, or Zuriel. Mammon, as the treasure keeper of hell, might appeal to envious characters, or those attempting to follow in Belimarius's footsteps. Meanwhile, numerous good deities like Sarenrae champion the importance of charitable work. Thinking about mechanics here is tricky, since, of all the schools of magic, abjuration is the school with the least obvious representation among the existing classes. The 2E Wizard School of Ars Grammatica is the best fit for a wizard attempting to specialize in abjuration in the post-remaster age. Clerics with the magic domain can accomplish this goal as well, and are generally well suited to the more defensive role that abjurers tend toward. Battle Herald clerics, in particular, are excellent at boosting their own defenses, while tearing down the defenses of others. And honestly, if you're willing to bend the rules a little bit, I really like the idea of a Battle Herald of a god like Archeros becoming the Runelord of Abjuration in the Age of Lost Omens. Witches might focus on abjuration by taking the Lesson of Protection feat, and bards might interpret the Rallying Anthem as an abjurant adjacent effect. For characters with familiars, turtles and tortoises, with their thick protective shells, are commonly seen as having a symbolic connection to abjuration. The martial class with the strongest connection to abjuration is almost certainly the Sparkling Targ Magus, with their specialized mastery of a magic-repellent shield. On the more offensive side of things, a thaumaturge, especially one with the Share Weakness feat, might interpret their mystical abilities as the clever application of abjuration magic. Humans were the dominant ancestry in ancient Edasseril, and the nation is noteworthy for having been virulently racist toward elves. And that's racist by Thassilonian standards, which were already pretty low. That said, I actually like the idea of an elf or Ayuvaran with some connection to either Miarani or Edasseril having to come to terms with the ancient hatred their people once suffered at the hands of the Lords of Envy. And, just like with the other schools of magic, there are a few other cultural touchstones on Golarion worth mentioning. The Brass Dwarf and the Betrayal Hero cards are seen as symbolic of abjuration by the Varisian peoples, while astrologers equate the school with Akaton, the Red Planet. For GMs looking to incorporate the School of Abjuration, the Runelords of Envy, or the nation of Edasseril into a campaign, here are a few more ideas. Though few scholars of ancient Thassilon have been able to get a good view into the crystalline, at least prior to the Age of Lost Omens, one thing which they all agreed on was that the Temple of Desna's first dream appears to have disappeared from within the frozen remnant of Xin-Edasseril. Desna, in the instant Belimarius' eye of jealousy collapsed, recognized the danger of what was about to happen. Faster than an eye blink, she reached into the material plane and snatched her temple, removing it from reality, before the bizarre amber crystal could consume the city. Rumors among Desna's faithful suggest that the temple still exists in the Great Beyond, likely hidden somewhere in the mysterious dimension of dreams. To access the temple would be a challenge well suited to high-level adventurers, and the rumored dreaming chamber within, which supposedly held the power to make even the most outlandish dreams come true, might prove a tempting prize for such heroes. I'll be covering the effects of the Earthfall calamity at the end of this series, but for the time being, you should know that Edasseril exists in the Age of Lost Omens as the Ironbound Archipelago, or the Ironbound Isles. This string of islands is partially ruled by the Lenorm king White Estrid, though the elves of the Mordant Spire rule in the south. This setting is notably different from much of the rest of Thassilon's former territory. Ulfin, not Varisian, is the dominant culture in the region, giving the whole territory a strong Norse legends vibe. GMs could have a lot of fun by drawing inspiration from modern Viking fantasy narratives and merging them with the Atlantis-adjacent flavor commonly associated with Thassilonian ruins. If you're looking for some Viking-themed inspiration, I highly recommend John Gwynn's Bloodsworn novels, the 2018 and 2022 God of War games, and the film The Northman from Robert Eggers. To get a bit more specific, the ruins of old Xin-Edasseril still exist off the coast in the Ironbound Archipelago. In fact, scholars on Golarion didn't realize until very recently that Belimarius had even moved the capital during her reign, and these mostly submerged ruins were thought to have been the capital city right up until their destruction. While Belimarius succeeded in moving her administrative center to its new location in the east, the city of Xin-Edasseril still existed after her departure, and many of the works of the former Runelords of Envy, unspecified though they may be, are likely still buried beneath the silt and the waves, waiting to be discovered. One other mysterious ruin of old Edasseril, which remains entirely unexplored in the Age of Lost Omens, is the Dome Hive. This is another one of those ruins which has, to my knowledge, only ever appeared in one publication, the Return of the Runelords Thassilonian map, produced by Damian Mamalidi. The structure appears to be an immense stone dome, roughly the shape of a cartoon beehive, and covered in spikes. If you're familiar with Pokemon, it actually looks like a big pharaoh seed stuck into the ground. What is this ruin? I honestly have no idea. I can't find any connection to insects or plants in any of the lore surrounding the Runelords of Envy, so your guess is as good as mine. I can't even tell if it still exists above the surface of the sea, based on my comparison of the ancient and modern maps of the region. Regardless of whether it is above or below the waves, it is almost certainly somewhere in here, right between Three Hags Rock and the city of Ormut. And that marks the end of my coverage of the Sin of Envy and the Runelords of Edasseril. I really struggled with this script, if I'm being honest. The number of Runelords of Envy was so high, and unlike the Runelords of Greed, who were the second highest in total number of Runelords, the lore distribution between the Runelords of Envy was completely out of balance. Naaft and Tannaris had bits of interesting lore, but then there was a huge gap in the lore record until the Rise of Belimarius. It made for a difficult scripting process. I hope I managed to keep it interesting. But I have good news. If you're starting to get tired of keeping track of all these Runelords, and I know I am, the next 2 videos will be a breeze. I've saved the 2 best and most powerful Runelords for last. The only 2 Runelords who were never overthrown, and who maintained complete control over their kingdoms for the entire 1,187-year period between their appointment by Xin and the eventual coming of Earthfall. So, tomorrow, I'm diving headfirst into the sin of pride, and my coverage of the mightiest of the Runelords, Xandergul, the satrap of Cyrusian and the master of illusion. I've hinted at Xandergul's power at a few points in this series, but tomorrow you'll see just how god tier he actually was. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.